My name's Tyler Kim. This is Ben.
I'm Ben Apple.
And I'm Porgano.
And we're in the youth culture and national identity in communist Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic with specification on activism, extremism, and free press. We'll be discussing how the fall of communism affected the youth culture of Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic. Communism provided a suppressive atmosphere in the Eastern Europe during the communist regime that's university students thrived under. Students were a large portion of demonstrators and protesters against the communist regime, and they were for the incorporation of the democratic system. Students used lowered press and media restrictions during the 60s and the 80s to help spread their messages to larger groups of people.
And we're also going to talk about the restrictions on mass media during communism and the evolution in youth in mass media after the fall of communism.
And we'll also be looking at how the fall of communism affected a rise in nationalism among the Czech youth and how that's leading to increased neo-Nazism and xenophobia.
Opposition to the communist regime was taken very seriously during the 1960s. Youth of any culture is going to be naturally defiant towards any suppressive authoritative figure. So naturally, the communist regime was one that was going to have a lot of opposition towards it. There was a violent suppression ending towards any kind of opposition towards the communist regime. And I noticed that with the fall of communism in Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic, there was a decline in student activism and participation in the government. This had to do with several factors such as increased government corruption, and how the government less directly suppresses its people without communism. During the 1960s, there was a lot of political unrest and unhappiness with the existing communist system. Students were involved in a lot of protests and demonstrations against the government. A lot of these protests gained a lot of national attention and a lot of attention from communist Soviet Russia, which was the big brother of any communist state. Eventually, Soviet Russia and other Warsaw Pact alliances sent in a military invasion into Czechoslovakia to try to suppress this counter-revolution. This upset a lot of the population of Czechoslovakia. They didn't really understand why the military invasion was there to suppress the peaceful protesters. So they didn't really agree with it at all. And the military invasion actually led to a lot of arrest of high-profile protesters and an eventual decline in any protest against the communist regime. There were some new officials that were placed in the government during the 1960s, but there wasn't much real change to the actual existing system. It was just done as kind of a facade to try to make people feel like stuff was actually happening. There were a lot of different consequences towards opposing the government. One of the most common in students was expulsions. This would happen to all types of protesters. It could happen to anybody, especially people that actually, or even to people that had family ties to people that were higher ranking in the Communist Party. Another pretty common consequence was jail time. And this picture right here is actually some protesters that are protesting the arrest of Alexander Dubček, who was the General Secretary of Czechoslovakia at the time. And he was actually considered the starter of the Prague Spring because he imposed a lot of reforms, or tried to impose a lot of reforms to the communist system during the 1960s, and therefore was arrested for it. One of the most, I think, ironic punishments that they would do to a lot of the students was mandatory military drafts. They would take the people that were actually opposing the system that they were protesting against, and they would put them in the military to try to make them fight to protect them. After the 1960s, during the 1970s, there wasn't much protest against the government. It was a lot more difficult. There were a lot more strenuous laws that would prevented people from protesting and actively and openly acting out against the government. During the 1980s, there was a general loss of momentum in the communist regime, which allowed for students to organize and more openly protest. They used a lot of Prague Spring-like protest tactics. They use a lot of peaceful protests and demonstrations and strikes to try to gain attention and try to gain followers and spread their views. The government retaliated similar to the way they did in the Prague Spring. The military force was still there from the 60s, so it had been 20 years that the military invasion was occurring. So they used a lot of police brutality and water cannons and arrests, which really shocked a lot of the Czechoslovak people, because they were shocked that the government would impose such violent tactics on their own children, basically. A lot of these people were people our age. They were university students, ages 18 to 25, and so that really gave the movement a lot of followers. Surely because, like, why would the communist people be so violent towards peaceful protesters? With this larger following, students and workers united to form a mass general strike, which occurred on November 17, 1989. This mass general strike literally brought the country to a standstill, like economically and everything, just completely shut the country down for a day. And this gained a lot of attention nationally and from the regime in Czechoslovakia. The Prime Minister at the time, Ladislav Adamek, tried to appease the protesters by imposing more democratic ideas in the communist system, but eventually Ladislav Adamek stepped down rather than ceding with the communist regime. And these people in this picture are actually celebrating the election of Václav Havel, who was elected immediately after Adamek stepped down. And after the fall of communism in Czechoslovakia, there was a lot of differences between the ethnic groups. The main two ethnic groups being the Czechs and the Slovaks. One of the main differences that was among the Czechs and the Slovaks was actually naming the country. The Czechs wanted to keep Czechoslovakia with just one word, where the Slovaks wanted to hyphenate it to Czechs and Slovaks, which kind of doesn't seem like a big deal, but they debated this for several months and eventually decided that the Czechs would just use Czechoslovakia and the Slovaks could do whatever they want and use the hyphen. This shows a lot of some serious underlying differences between the two ethnic groups. Eventually, Czechoslovakia, after 3 years of being a common state, separated on December 31st of 1992 into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Since then, in the Czech Republic, there's been less activism in the government and less participation in youth in voting. This has to do with, this is the case because of several reasons. One of the main reasons is that the government is less severe than it used to be, as in, like, they don't suppress the people as much as they used to, so the people just don't really feel like they need to protest as hard as they used to. Another reason is that protests are just generally not as effective as they used to be. We have parades in America now that are bigger than a lot of the protests that were going on in Czechoslovakia during the 60s and 80s, and so now gathering a bunch of people towards a common goal doesn't necessarily do as much as it used to, especially without the communist regime trying to suppress them. Another reason is corruption. Corruption is in any government system. However, the Czech Republic, it's gained a lot of momentum since the fall of communism, and a lot of the Czech people feel like it used to be easier to bribe government officials under communism, and so they don't really like the democratic system because now they don't know who to bribe. The Czechs use media to help spread out views to other people and gain momentum.
All right. Czech media, mass media. This is a picture of the newest Czech newspaper. It said Mička, and it means 7 in Czech. Okay, I'm curious, does anybody know the percentage of households in the world that own a TV? Anybody have a guess?
54.
It's actually 99%. 99% of households, so it's virtually every household. The average child in the world watches 1,680 minutes of TV per week. The Komsomolskaya Pravda, which was the communist newspaper, exceeded 21,500,000 copies per day. And in the Czech Republic, the daily circulation of newspapers is 1,704,000. So what I'm trying to get at here is just how vast mass media is, how many people it reaches. the widespread, how fast news can travel, it has a huge influence. Even in Bud's classes presentations, there was both the presentations I went to mentioned media somehow affecting the people and changing people's opinions or letting them create their opinion. Okay, under communist rule, the media was controlled by the KSC, which was the Czech Communist Party. And under this, there was no private publications. The government were the only ones who could control what was published, with the exception of the church. The church had several newspapers, which actually had to go through the government before being published. People could have two possible attitudes towards the media and the government. The first, they could step out of line, they could take illegal photos, write illegal things, publish, take illegal videos, and that would result in them speaking out against the government, so they could be jailed, they would be ridiculed by the government. The second was to simply just go along with what the government was doing and was telling them, basically brainwashing them. They had no opinion. It was biased, so that's all they heard. A quote by Václav Havel, it says, the tragedy of modern man is not that he knows less and less about the meaning of his own life, but that it bothers him less and less. To me, this is talking about the youth that was born into communism. They didn't know anything else but what the government was telling them. It was extremely biased, so they virtually didn't have any personal opinion, and this didn't even bother them because they didn't know anything else. They only knew what they were being told, and they only knew the lies that were coming to them. Headline domination. This is a copy of the Rude Pravo, which means the red right or the red law, and this was the Czech newspaper under communism. The headlines for this paper were either very pro-government or very anti-anyone who spoke out against the government. So an example of the headline, Czech communist leader says party will try to form coalition. A lot of these were political, had to deal with political parties. And something that interested me, Ivan Urios, which is a guy, he was in a band called the Plastic People during that time. And these bands were not allowed to sing anything against the government. He actually sang a song in public against the government, and the headlines in this newspaper ridiculed him for weeks. They tore him apart, made him seem like the worst person. Okay, dynamic development. During 1989 and 1990, the new Press Act was released, and this abolished censorship and abolished it allowed private publications, not just government. Government was done. So this was free press, and this was huge for not just the youth, but for everyone. I mean, people could say what they wanted to say, they could write what they wanted to write. The news would be unbiased to a certain extent. And this was all great, except there was one problem, which was no experience. Everyone who was in the news, writing articles, displaying the news, like they all were let go, they had biased opinions, so that kind of put things at a standstill, like who was going to deliver the news, there was no one to do that. This man, Vladimir Železny, he was huge. He was an icon at the time. In his youth, he published illegal photos that are very famous to this day, and that's how he kind of got his name out there. So once free press took place, he created this TV station called TV Nova. It was a news channel. And he hired all youth, people who had no experience in this. He taught them how to deliver the news, how to portray themselves when they were delivering the news. He taught them how to use the machines to deliver the news, teleprompters. So he basically created a democratic foundation, and he was so inspirational that there's now an organization that started because of what he did, called the Youth Media Lab, which is going on right now in Czech Republic, and it teaches the youth tactics like what he did, how to deliver the news, and it starts from a young age, so they're familiar with it. Individualization. During this time, there was an increase of time spent watching television, although there were many new channels such as cartoons, sports channels, entertainment channels. So the youth kind of moved away from the news and the politics into these more exciting channels. And this generation was known as the go-getters because they could retrieve their information. They didn't have to wait to hear what the papers were telling them. They could talk and spread news by word of mouth, which wasn't allowed during communism. They didn't really have any privacy, and they could be jailed for that. They used this new media as a private space to create from their parents. They separated themselves from society. It was their own sense of freedom. and it was the first time they could form their own real band. They